Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But you know, KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast.
Good morning. This is Tracy Hales-Vass with Right On Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico. Today, I'm excited to talk with W. Michael Farmer, Ph.D., about his new book, The Odyssey of Geronimo, 23 Years a Prisoner of War, a novel. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Tracy. It's a pleasure to hear from you.
And it was definitely a pleasure to read about the Odyssey of Geronimo, the 23 Years a Prisoner of War.
Yeah, that's kind of a subject that few people know much about, I think.
I think you're right. And when you had to wrote about Geronimo, I was surprised when I got the book and saw that it was just from the last 23 years of his life, 1886 to 1909.
Yeah, I have several other books, and in fact, I have one that is called the Iliad of Geronimo, which is into the publisher, but like a lot of other things, it's kind of been stymied by the plague.
But you do right off the bat compare this to the Odyssey of Homer. I thought it was interesting that you chose that time after his surrender, because he's so known for his wartime escapades. But this is a little bit different.
Yeah, and that was one reason why I found it so interesting, because those years, if you dig through the history, I think really show the character of the man, and it's just filled with surprises.
Yes.
About what his life was like, rather than what you might have imagined it to be. A lot of folks for a long time have thought that he spent that time in a jail cell, when in fact he actually only spent a few days, and those were when the MPs at Fort Sill put him in the calaboose because he was drunk.
And you chose to write this in his point of view, in first person, which I found interesting. Was that difficult?
No, not really, because I kind of empathize with his humanity. You know, authors that write in first person like that are trying to channel the other person. Geronimo was, in his pre-surrender days, was a hard-eyed killer. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, he had a very close-knit family that he cared very deeply for. I was hesitant to try to write it that way, because his psychology and character are so complex.
Right.
But I decided to go ahead and stick my neck out and try it. And I think I got within a mile or two of what he was like.
I think so. I really felt like I was sitting right next to him. Thoughts and what he was going through. And he had many battles of a different kind while he was a prisoner of war.
Yeah, he really did.
And a lot of wives.
Well, actually, during the time that he was a prisoner of war, he only had 3.
Right.
And after he sent away his young Mescalero wife to save her life, he never had more than one wife at a time. Although he married twice, again after his last wife died.
Yeah, I found that very interesting. And the relationships that he had with his children, grandson, nephews were all very interesting and well done, well captured.
Thank you.
Yeah, you see him even as an older man changing his ways and changing his thoughts. And he battled a lot with religion, Christianity versus the Apache way.
Yeah, did that surprise you? It surprised me that he had actually become a Christian. Who would have dreamed that an Apache medicine man would become a Christian?
That did surprise me. And I thought at the time, you must have done a lot of research.
Well, it's there in dust-covered books if you want to find it. I think it's now that people are reading so much about him that's going to become common knowledge after a while.
Well, why don't we take a minute or so and have you read from the Odyssey of Geronimo?
I'll read the story of when he divorced his young Mescalero wife, Tata. He had taken her as a young woman who was not married in order to replace wife that had been captured from him when he broke out the last time. And scene is where he's at Mount Vernon Barracks, and the Mescaleros have squeezed the government enough that the government is willing to release the Mescaleros that had gotten swept up with the Chiricahuas when they were made prisoners of war. It takes place in a log cabin that he shares with his wives. The other wife is Zaye, and it begins. My family ate our evening meal by Tata's fire. Zaye looked at me with eyes filled with desire as she and Fenton went to their sleeping place. I looked away. She knew I wouldn't come to her that night. I waited until Tata put Lena on her satch, that's her cradle board, and came back to sit beside me at the fire. I rolled a cigarette in an oak leaf, lit it with a splinter from the cooking fire, smoked to the 4 directions, and then passed it to Tata. She smoked to the 4 directions, and since she didn't smoke often, I knew she felt the smoke bite the insides of her mouth and nose. But she was pleased I honored her this way. She handed the cigarette back and waited with her hands folded across her belly, patient and ready to hear serious business. I finished the cigarette and tossed the remains into the low, flickering yellow flames just above the rocks around the fire pit. Outside, the winter wind swished through the tops of the tall pines, sounding like the big water rolling and crashing onto the edge of our island in Pensacola Bay. Staring into the fire, I gathered my thoughts. Even as my heart said, I must not speak to her of this. Tata, I've decided you and Lena must go. I waved a hand toward the door. Leave me. Return to your mother and father in Mescalero. Tata looked at me as though I held a stick of wood and was about to beat her. Although I had never done such a thing with any of my wives, I tried to show only determination on my face, the same unbending will that had carried me across many wars and the killing of many enemies. Tata stared at the dirt floor, her breath sounding as if she had run a race. I knew she spoke slowly to keep her voice from wavering. Why do you say this? I had no man before you. You stole me from my people. I hated you then, but I learned to love you. I've been a good wife for you. Our place is always clean. You never have to wait to eat. I've just come to you in our blankets that we might have another child. Our daughter is a delight, whole and perfect and filled with laughter. Have mercy on us. I beg you not to send us away. I remembered the dream of Alope and the memory of Alicio Creek and said, you must go. The Bluecoats may change their mind any time, and kill us all. You know, in less than half a moon, they'll free the mescaleros they took to Florida, but not the Chiricahuas and the Cayenes. You are a mescalero. I should be a mescalero because I married you. But the White Eyes will never let me go. There's no reason for you to lose your life. Yes, I took you without courting you. Now you have a chance to be free. Take it. Save our people with your children and your knowledge of our life ways. You're a fine wife. Our daughter Lena is a good child. But if she stays in this bad air, this place of white sickness, she'll soon make the journey to the happy place, and you won't be far behind her, even if the bluecoats don't shoot us all. Please, husband, I want to stay with you. Woman, you must go. Take Lena and go. That is all I have to say. She buried her face in her hands. When she looked at me, there was water in her eyes, and she threw her arms around my neck and croaked in a whisper, I'll do as my husband says I must. I rubbed her back and said, Tata is a good woman. Save yourself and our child from this place of death. And I might add that the only children that survived Geronimo as bloodline were the two children that Tata had. She was pregnant when she left Mount Vernon Barracks, but Geronimo didn't know it. Right. He didn't know he had a son until about 15 years later.
Robert.
That's right, Robert.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And Eva, of course, stuck by his side.
Right.
Until she passed.
Zaye. Yeah, that's right.
It was interesting to me that he sent her away, and it showed compassion in him, maybe something that he hadn't had before, because he had taken the wife. He captured her, but because of his compassion and his kind nature, she did fall in love with him, and then it was an act of love that he sent her away, really.
Yeah, that's right, and I thought that that scene so clearly showed the character and love he had for his family, that he was willing to give her up.
And I guess in the same vein, he made some decisions for Eva.
That I thought was kind of extraordinary, but it was what it was.
But he still, and you captured this quite well, that throughout, Geronimo cooperated, made good decisions, but always pined for that freedom. Asked so many times to have the reservation.
Yeah, he desperately wanted to go back to the area where he was born in the Gila Mountains,
right,
up on the border of Arizona and New Mexico, and that he really longed to do that. And he, as you might have read in the book, he begged Theodore Roosevelt to be let go and return there. And there's a lot more to that than meets the eye, and that I could put in the book, because in the 1883, when General Crook brought all of the Chiricahuas out of Mexico back to San Carlos, that's pretty much where Geronimo wanted to go, and he told Crook, well, you don't need a reservation boundary anymore, and if you'll just get rid of the white people that live in that area, everything will be nice and peaceful. Well, when he's begging Theodore Roosevelt to go back, he's basically saying the same thing. And Roosevelt and virtually every manager in the government was not about to let him do that. They knew that if he went back to Arizona, there would be blood for a long, long time, because the settlers were sitting back just waiting for him to return to
I wondered while I read it if it would happen like that.
Probably so. It's just kind of remarkable when you read the papers of that time, like 1900 to 1910. There was still an awful lot of bitterness about the fighting and the killing and the raiding that went on. And if during that time, during the wars before Geronimo surrendered, if they came across anybody that was not part of their band, they killed them. They were afraid not to, because they thought somebody would tell the soldiers where they were, and they did a lot of things that I think they regretted that I tried to convey in the book. Those regrets, I think, left an awful lot of bitterness there in Arizona.
And fear, I think.
And fear.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Yeah, there's one flashback you have in there of a particularly bloody encounter with the Mexicans.
Yeah, that you're talking about the Ash Flat. Yeah, that's people nowadays have kind of a romanticized view of Geronimo, and perhaps in his days after he surrendered, that is somewhat justified. But in the days before, the massacre that took place there at Ash Flat, while he was on the way to force Locos Kahini people off the reservation and into Mexico with the Chiricahuas, there was just no mercy.
Yeah, it was
That
brutal.
he would show to the Mexicans. That's right. And this young man that he had actually taken and raised for a little while, Mestis. It's just kind of startling to see how someone that you could raise like that, and yet when he got old enough, you wound up selling him later, just murdering him and his entire family is just kind of something that just doesn't compute. But that's
Right.
the way things were.
Yeah, that really brings and shows the change that Geronimo went through.
Yeah, I think so.
So like you said, so many of the books that you've written previous to this have Geronimo. So did you do new research, or did you just collect the research that you had been doing over the years for this book, or did you have to do a whole lot more?
Well, it was kind of a combination of both. I knew the difference in his life, obviously, after he surrendered. What I wanted to capture was what a lot of people really didn't seem to know, and so I did have to do quite a bit of detailed research, although a lot of it is in the history books that have gathered dust over the years. But the challenge was really bringing all of the parts and pieces together into something that was coherent and would make a good story.
It is a good story. And I know that we're all familiar with the photographs, the abundant photographs of Geronimo. And I found it interesting how you brought out the fact that people wanted his photograph and paid him money for that, and for his autograph, and for the things he made.
Yeah.
And his attitude was kind of, why not?
Yeah, I think he was helped a lot by the man that he actually tried to get rid of, George Ratton,
Right.
who stayed with the Apaches from the time that they surrendered, and they knew of him well before that when he worked as a clerk, and he was 15 at the trading post there at San Carlos. And he was a packer during some of the fighting that went on after they escaped the reservation the last time. But he seemed to have a real gift for languages. Was able to he was one of the few that the Apaches trusted to accurately translate their language, and so the way that Geronimo wound up treating him was kind of bad there for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they eventually came to a meeting of the minds and got along fairly well after that.
Yeah, I think that Geronimo respected him after a while. I thought it was interesting how his grandson, he asked to write his biography and wouldn't let a stenographer do it.
No, he became friends with the school superintendent for the local school district, the Lawton School District. The man's name was S.M. Barrett, and he had told Barrett a number of stories about his wartime and the history of the Apaches as he knew it. And so Barrett asked him to write a book about it, about all these stories. And Geronimo wouldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And reading between the lines, the reason that he wouldn't was because he was fearful that he would tell Barrett something that might be used against him. And so he worked out an arrangement where Barrett wrote down what the translator told him as Geronimo told the story, and Geronimo agreed that he would tell him his life story for half the proceeds from the book. But he really had to be careful that he didn't spill the beans, if you will. And as a result of him telling the story, there were a lot of people that rode with him that wound up being fearful that he had put them in danger of government arresting them for past raids and murders and what have you. But he was very careful not to do that. Barrett apparently put in a lot of stuff in that autobiography that he had gotten from military records that were just inaccurate.
Oh.
And Daklugi, who was the translator, mm-hmm. and Geronimo's nephew, he was actually his second cousin, but he called him nephew. Daklugi told Eve Ball, who wrote a widely accepted oral history that she got from the Apaches that lived there at Mescalero, that yes, it was full of errors. Geronimo knew it, he knew it, but they weren't bad enough that he was going to raise any flags about it, and he just sat back and let it go forward.
Yeah, you have a list of quite a few books for further reading about Geronimo, and I assume that you looked and read through these for your research.
Yeah, those are the main ones.
So do you write full time now?
I do. As a matter of fact, I just recently finished a novel about Geronimo's capture of a 12-year-old girl named Trinidad Verdin, who lived on a ranch about 8 miles northwest Nogales, Arizona. And he took her about about 4 months before he surrendered. After she was living with her aunt on the ranch, and her aunt was pregnant and had a little son who was 2 years old. And one morning, Geronimo and 15 men showed up at the door. They wound up killing the aunt and the little boy and riding off with her. And surprisingly, Geronimo let her uncle live. They had caught him about 2 miles from the ranch house. They took all his clothes except for his red long-handled underwear and his boots, and he had to walk back through the desert to find his wife and child killed. And then he had to walk another 6 miles to Calabasas, where people took him in. And Geronimo rode off with the young girl. Her name was Trini Verdin. And she, everything that we know about what he did for the next 2 months, virtually was what she wound up telling the Captain Lawton after she was rescued by some Mexican militia. It's really a fascinating story, and I have to confess that I learned, I think, more about Geronimo watching him through her eyes than I did writing the book about him after he surrendered.
Interesting. And is that one finished now?
Yes, it is. It's into the publisher, but again, I have no idea when it will be published.
Okay.
I had written before that I had written a companion book to go with the Odyssey called the Iliad of Geronimo, A Song of Blood and Fire, because I really consider Geronimo's story and the wars that went on truly an American epic story.
Yes.
And the parallels between what went on 10 years before Geronimo surrendered, which was also the length of the Trojan War.
Ah, right, right.
An American epic. You know, the Apaches believe that they basically had a fort or a fortress in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Mm-hmm. You know, it was there are some really remarkable parallels between that and the Trojan War. They surrendered as a result of being deceived, just like the Greeks deceived the Trojans. Although the deception probably was not nearly as murderous as what the Trojans underwent, but still there are some remarkable parallels between the Apache Wars and the Trojan War.
History repeats itself, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It's really been a pleasure chatting with you.
And you too. Now you have a really good website at wmichaelfarmer.com. where listeners can go check out the books that you've written. Yeah, The Odyssey of Geronimo, 23 Years a Prisoner of War, a novel. And we look forward to the next one.
Well, I'll be sending it to you when it comes out.
You better do that. I look forward to it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And that was Dr. W. Michael Farmer talking to us about his well-researched novel, The Odyssey of Geronimo, 23 Years a Prisoner of War. This is Tracy Hales Vass with Right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico.
Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.